Hello, I'm Ashravinsky. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. Now, on this episode, we dive into the fascinating world of international diplomacy, or as I like to call it, who's awkwardly shaking hands with whom this week. And this week's headline is, did Dmytro Kuleba's visit start a new chapter in China-Ukraine relations? Well, it is complicated. Imagine trying to mediate a conflict between two of your friends while also trying not to ruin your own plans for world domination. That is China's current predicament in a nutshell. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba met with his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi. The meeting marks Kuleba's first visit to China since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion. During the talks, Yi stressed that China consistently supports Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. China has taken a seemingly neutral position in the Russia-Ukraine war, positioning itself as a mediator, but at the same time has deepened economic ties with Moscow. Beijing only stressed last year the need to respect the territorial integrity of all countries, including Ukraine. China has become a major source of dual-use goods for Russia, supplying equipment that the Russian war machine can use in its attacks on Ukraine. Beijing, however, denies accusations of helping Russia in its Ukrainian war effort. During a meeting in Laos with his US counterpart Antony Blinken, Wang Yi stressed that China would take forceful measures to protect its national interests. Moreover, China has accused the United States and other Western countries of exacerbating the Russian war by supplying Ukraine with a steady flow of weapons and military aid. NATO, in turn, dubbed Beijing a decisive enabler of the conflict. The United States has imposed sanctions on Chinese companies selling Russia equipment that Washington says could aid the war effort. China has never condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine and accuses NATO of ignoring Russia's security concerns.
And now, as always, it's time to take a closer look at the issue at hand. So Dmytro Kuleba, Ukraine's foreign minister, decided to visit China. Much like showing up at your frenemy's housewarming party, it is awkward, tense and filled with potential for drama. The visit was highly anticipated because, let's face it, anything involving Ukraine and Russia these days is bound to be a hot mess. Kuleba's visit is the first to China by a high-level Ukrainian official since Russia invaded Ukraine 29 months ago. Now, why is this significant? Because China, while pretending to be neutral, is basically best friends with Russia. They have each other on speed dial. Kuleba's trip suggests that Kyiv is looking to revitalize the diplomatic process and maybe, just maybe, convince Beijing to pressure Moscow into ending the war. Now, China has always branded itself as a peacemaker in the Russia-Ukraine war, like that one friend who claims to be a matchmaker but never actually sets anyone up. Despite their lofty claims, they have done next to nothing in terms of practical efforts to mediate. Beijing's reluctance to seriously engage with Kyiv while deepening ties with Moscow has been a sore point for Ukraine. For the longest time, Ukraine and its allies have been calling out to China, hoping Beijing would step in as a mediator. But the administration under Xi Jinping has been playing hard to get. Senior Chinese officials have consistently avoided engaging with Ukrainian officials. Ukraine's ambassador to China, Pavlo Ryabkin, has sent requests to nearly 40 different ministries and municipalities since last summer and has only secured a handful of meetings. Now, let me remind you that in June, President Zelensky accused China of derailing Ukraine's peace summit in Switzerland and even claimed China was assisting Russia's war efforts. Now, despite all this, Kuleba's visit signals that Kyiv isn't giving up on influencing Russia's most important international partner. Interestingly enough, while Kuleba was in China for several days, he wasn't received by any senior national-level officials besides Wang Yi. He was also relegated to Guangzhou instead of Beijing. It's like being invited to a party but told to hang out in the garage. Meanwhile, Xi Jinping, China's supreme leader, found time to meet Sergei Lavrov, Kuleba's Russian counterpart, when he visited Beijing in April. Clearly, Xi Jinping has a favorite, And it's not Kuleba. Western security and criticism of China's pro-Russian stance, meanwhile, are growing louder and louder. This, coupled with economic sluggishness, has made Beijing wary of how its ties with Russia affect its global interests. Chinese banks have started tightening the processing of Russian payments due to the fear of US secondary sanctions. Trade between China and Russia, which grew rapidly in 2022 and 2023, has seen a decline in the first half of 2024. China's financial institutions are beginning to block payments to and from Russian companies, showing that even China is getting cold feet. In early July, China also introduced additional export controls on a wide range of products that can be used in the military industry, signaling a cautious approach to its partnership with Russia. So, while Kuleba's visit may not have been a game-changer, it does show that Ukraine is persistently trying to leverage China's considerable influence over Russia. To sum up, Kuleba's visit is a step, albeit a small one, towards possibly getting China to push Russia toward a peaceful resolution. But don't hold your breath, just yet at least. This is international diplomacy after all, where progress moves at the speed of a sloth on tranquilizers. And now, here to shed more light on this subject is our guest, Rana Mitter, St. Lee Chair in US-Asia Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, great to be with you.
So let us begin with the aftermath of Dmytro Kuleba's visit to China. It has taken place in Guangzhou, not Beijing. So some have pointed out that this might actually indicate the rank of the visit. Nevertheless, would you say that this overall was an important moment? And also, is it going to have, in the foreseeable future, any sort of tangible benefits for Ukraine in the course of its efforts to end the war?
I think it is an important moment from both sides, both Ukraine and China. For Ukraine, it's an indication that their key diplomatic goal, which is to make sure that any important player in international diplomacy is not cut out of some potential negotiation, is maintained. And that, of course, includes China. China has expressed great enthusiasm for being part of a peacemaking process, but hasn't over the last couple of years been very active in terms of implementable solutions. So the fact that we have this continuing sense from Ukraine that it mustn't let China go, that I think will be justified by the fact that this meeting has in fact happened. On the Chinese side, there is a strong enthusiasm to be seen as peace brokers in international society. You might remember that about a week or so ago in Beijing, two different Palestinian groupings, Fatah and the PLO and Hamas, were present in Beijing. The results of those meetings, like the one with Minister Kuleba, were probably not very immediately in the short term effective, but over time they show that both Ukraine wants to keep China in the game, and China wants to at least to be seen to be part of that wider set of diplomatic maneuvers.
Would you say that China's problem really is that on the one hand we have its entanglement with Russia, both economic and political, and some have even suggested that it is in China's interest for the war to continue a bit longer to weaken both the West and Russia so that China can reap the benefits. But also on the other hand we have China's involvement with the West, not perhaps with Ukraine itself to such a great extent, but countries forming part of the Belt and Road Initiative, other trading partners, the United States of course also. So all of these countries, they have some sort of leverage. To what extent do you think China still has the capacity to be an honest broker? Can it still be an enabler of peace? Or does it run the risk of being accused of being an enabler of war, as some have already said that it is fulfilling this particular function? In short, what is China's position here? Because it seems a bit enigmatic, despite all the best efforts to try and determine what it is.
So it's interesting, when you put the question to me, you defined it as China's problem. But of course, many people in China's strategic apparatus would think of this as an opportunity. It is the case that China doesn't like the idea, which, there's been a lot of public criticism, that China could do more and isn't doing very much. But what it sees at the moment is the opportunity to keep various key decision makers around the world on side. So first of all, let's just remind ourselves that Russia has been declared by China to be a partner with no upper limit. This is a very big, wide phrasing. It can be a bit vague in terms of how it operates, but I think there's no doubt that Xi Jinping, China's president, China's party general secretary, wants to make it clear that he's not going to cut Russia off in any sense whatsoever. And there have been visits by Vladimir Putin and other senior Russian officials to Beijing on a regular basis. So in that sense, China's making it very clear that if there's going to be a pathway to Russia, Beijing may be one of the only pathways where that's actually able to operate. At the same time, China knows that while it's useful to have Russia in its corner, not least in terms of its rhetoric against the West, when it comes to trade and international business, actually the West is much more important. China does much more trade with the EU and even its great adversary, the United States, than it does with Russia. Russia, I think, is number 6 trading partner on China's list. And to that extent, China doesn't want to get caught up in sanctions, secondary sanctions on banking, finance, and other sensitive areas. So for that reason, it's treading a very delicate path. If you look at the readout of the meeting with Dmytro Kuleba, the Chinese side, the spokeswoman Mao Ning, was very careful not to give any particular view. She just said that China and Ukraine had exchanged views on the conflict. And this, in a way, I think is very much symbolic of what they're trying to do, not alienate anyone completely and keep themselves flexible in case there's a move made elsewhere, whether in Moscow, Washington, or indeed in Kyiv.
So what about weapons deliveries? There has been a statement made by President Volodymyr Zelensky shortly after the meeting in which he said that China has effectively undertaken not to deliver weapons to Moscow. This statement has caused a bit of a controversy because it doesn't seem that it was entirely confirmed in the wake of the meeting. So it seemed like something that was a takeaway from the Ukrainian side. Do you think that the reason why it appeared might have been that Ukraine wants to create this sort of fait accompli, saying, look, we're saying what you might have said, perhaps in private, perhaps you might have actually said this, but not really willing for this to be made public. But here it is public now, so it actually creates a sort of, perhaps not a sense of urgency, but a feeling that at least something is made in public, it becomes something of an undertaking, something that you can latch onto later on, further statements and discussions. Can you perhaps tell us more about this? Because I think it's an interesting issue there, unless, of course, there has been any subsequent confirmation of this position from the Chinese side. I don't believe there has.
No, there hasn't. Look, it's a really interesting question, but I think it's almost the other way around. Now, let's be clear to the viewers. I was not in the room, nor am I likely to be, and I suspect you weren't either. So we don't really know exactly what happened. I think that if the Chinese side, Minister Wang Yi and others, had given any kind of firm commitment that they would not supply military equipment to Russia, then actually Dmytro Kuleba and the Ukrainian side would have said absolutely nothing, because that would have been such a big confidential win that they wouldn't have given it away. I think the fact that the minister came out making this statement is actually a sign that really nothing of the sort was directly said in the meeting at all. And as you say, it's a way on both sides to try and control the narrative. If you read the readout of the Ukrainian side, it's very detailed in some ways in making these statements, particularly also about Ukraine's sovereignty and the reaffirmation of sovereignty. On the Chinese side, it's a quite short statement and it says very little of substance at all. I think in some senses, the question about military provisions is a slightly, it's one where you can read into it what you want. And I say that because if you think about what Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, said in an interview not very long ago, he actually acknowledged that as far as the West knows, Beijing is not shipping weapons as such to Russia. It's been pretty clear about not wanting to bust sanctions on that particular issue. That's different from North Korea, which is very blatantly providing weapons. And indeed, Putin and Kim Jong-un were seen enjoying a car ride together in Pyongyang just a few weeks ago as a result. What China is likely doing is continuing to provide technological support to Russia, which can be used either for civilian or for military issues. And that's why it's very hard to pin down the statement that China is supplying, it's hard to actually say in a definitive sense that there's a supply of weapons to Moscow, because Beijing is not currently, in the way that anyone can see, making a direct shipment of that sort at all. But it is the case that technological cooperation continues between Moscow and Beijing, and it's in that space where people are looking for how supportive they are being of Moscow, and then try and calibrate that against this meeting with the foreign minister of Ukraine.
And also, Antony Blinken has made a reference to that very issue after his conversation with Wang Yi on the sidelines of the ASEAN summit in Laos. He said that America would institute certain measures if Beijing continues to prop up Moscow in this particular way. And this was not the first time that something like that has actually appeared. Of course, China has fired back that essentially China's intentions are misunderstood here, that we want to create this sort of win-win situation while cooperating, but also you need to respect our position and so on. But the key takeaway perhaps should be that this is an issue that is still being raised by the US. But does the US have any leverage there? There have been reports, for example, that Chinese banks and institutions are not quite as willing to cooperate with Russia because of fear of secondary sanctions applying. So this leverage still exists. How much does it actually go?
I think you're right that in the field of finance in particular, there is a feeling in China that that is where the country is most vulnerable. Things also such as SWIFT, the international interbank transfer system, which operates globally. If China were to find itself suddenly restricted or cut off from that, as happened to Russia after 2022, then China, which depends very strongly on international remittances, would find itself in trouble. So I think it's fair to say that China's financial institutions have been very, very cautious about not breaking those sorts of sanctions. On the other hand, in some other areas, so for instance, the import of fossil fuels, China has been very clear that it does not intend to restrict its imports, and it's getting actually significant amounts of its energy provision in gas and in oil from Russia. The same, by the way, of course, is true of India, a country which is traditionally regarded as either neutral or indeed in some ways it's been moving a little bit more towards the West because it too is wary of China. But it's also buying huge amounts of fossil fuel from Russia. Indeed, we saw recently a very friendly meeting between Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Vladimir Putin. So in those circumstances, China looks for opportunities where you might say there's cover. In other words, they can say, look, we're buying oil from Russia, okay, but so are the Indians. But in some areas like finance, where it's not so possible to take that risk, there they are indeed being quite cautious about not busting those international sanctions, where the US does still have quite a lot of coercive power.
And a very quick question, because we are unfortunately running out of time. You've mentioned the confirmation of Ukrainian sovereignty, but should we really read that much into it? I mean, China has an interest in maintaining this principle because according to the Chinese law, Taiwan is part of China. So when they say territorial sovereignty, they mean Taiwan is a part of us and we're not accepting anything else. So would you just say that, it's more of a statement of principle than anything else and that Ukraine benefits from it indirectly?
I think you have to read it in two statements that have been made. The first one, the one you mentioned about respecting sovereignty, which China does make a very central part of its diplomacy. The other part is this more recent statement, but the interests of major powers have to be taken into account. Now, more directly, they're talking about Russia feeling, as it claims, some ways being threatened by NATO. NATO, of course, would not agree with that. But that is the get-out clause, you might say, in terms of China needing to compromise on sovereignty. And that may become relevant if there is an Asia-oriented crisis in the future. Fortunately, right now we don't have that. Let's hope there's enough diplomacy to make sure that that doesn't occur and we do not get a Ukraine-type situation in Asia.
And of course, the argument related to Russia basically following its own interests and deterring a potential NATO expansion is particularly hard to swallow in the West and might prove difficult when considering any sort of peace plan involving all the major powers. As you say, there is still going to be the issue of China accepting Russia's interests as they are, whereas the West sees it as an open act of unprovoked aggression, basically, against Ukraine. Rana Mitte was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a curated selection of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. Dozens of Russian mercenaries from the Wagner Group were killed and more were wounded during a clash with Mali's rebels in the north of the country. Russia maintains a strong presence in Africa, supporting authoritarian governments, fueling destabilization and securing resources to fund the war against Ukraine.
Since the 2021 coup and the subsequent overthrowing of the government, the West African nation of Mali has been the subject of a significant Russian influence campaign. A two-day battle on the outskirts of the village of Tinzawaten earlier this week ended with local rebel fighters destroying an entire column of the Malian army and Russian mercenaries. Russian pro-war Telegram channels, including those linked to the Wagner Group, have published photos and videos showing the bodies of dead mercenaries and destroyed equipment. Wagner mercenaries fought in Ukraine and in June 2023 launched a brief rebellion against the Kremlin, marching on Moscow, which abruptly ended. After the failed coup, in order to avoid sentencing, some Wagner members signed contracts with the Russian Ministry of Defense, whereas some were sent to fight in Africa.
Ukrainian soldiers who have suffered injuries of varying degrees of severity can undergo rehabilitation at almost any health facility in the country, both civilian and military. Local authorities have revealed that more than 75% of wounded Ukrainian soldiers return to duty after completing the rehabilitation process.
Ukraine and its NATO partners aim to launch a project to create 5 rehabilitation centers for Ukrainian soldiers. Equipped with modern technology, the centers are intended to provide soldiers with high-quality treatment. Mechinkov Hospital, a regional medical center in Dmytro that treats frontline soldiers from the Donbass, has treated about 29,000 wounded soldiers since the war began on a full scale. Kyiv has not disclosed the total number of wounded Ukrainian soldiers since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. What is known is that from the beginning of the invasion to the end of February 2024, at least 31,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed.
According to local reports, officials in Baku are drafting a protest to the International Olympic Committee and prepare to submit a diplomatic complaint to France, the host of the ongoing Paris Olympic Games. The case pertains to the live commentary of the opening ceremony.
The decision comes in response to the words of a French public television commentator who reportedly called Armenians our friends and suggested that Nagorno-Karabakh had recently passed into the hands of the Azerbaijani army. The alleged remarks came during the segment introducing national contingents at the opening ceremony in Paris. Olympic authorities so far gave no official confirmation of any Azerbaijani complaint. Nagorno-Karabakh is an internationally recognized territory of Azerbaijan, but ethnic Armenians backed by Yerevan controlled it for decades until Azerbaijani forces regained it in September 2023. The IOC has strict rules that aim to avoid introducing politics into sports competitions and official events.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.